Welcome back to the Modernization of Diablo, a series where we're comparing the systems, features, and campaigns of Diablo 1 and 4 to see how they can produce such remarkably different player experiences, despite both titles being dark ARPGs in the same franchise. We're also looking at how Diablo 4 ultimately made gameplay that felt meaningless to me, and the aspects of the game that contributed to that feeling. Let's start this episode with a brief overview of Diablo 2 and 3 to give us more context for Diablo 4's designs, and then let's dig into Diablo 4. So, how do we get from the flawed but unique Diablo 1 to the more streamlined, story-focused Diablo 4? Well, Diablo 2 and 3 present an obvious progression of the series to a more action-oriented, streamlined experience. In Diablo 2, though you're a more mobile and capable character, new players will likely still feel vulnerable, occasionally, due to the difficulty of some creature packs, relatively punishing death mechanics, limited checkpoints, and limited town portals. Though it has resource management similar to Diablo 1, Diablo 2 simplifies these features just a little bit and introduces a ton of new systems and features, but we're not going to get into that right now. That's a topic for a different discussion. The feeling of vulnerability that was so key to the original Diablo experience was eroded in Diablo 2. And then it was totally vaporized in Diablo 3 through some foundational design decisions discussed in the game's initial announcement.
The barbarian overcomes his enemies with pure brute force. He's the perfect example of our character design philosophy. There's no such thing as too much power.
This explicit change in direction to intentionally making the player feel overpowered fundamentally altered how the player felt when first going through the world. From a cautious dungeon delver in Diablo 1, to a more capable, but still vulnerable adventurer in Diablo 2, to an all-powerful Nephilim in Diablo 3. D3 also removed much of the resource management from previous games. No potion belt, no item durability, scrolls of identification and town portal were now gone, and the inventories were much larger. And some of the features which made players feel vulnerable in the previous games, like player hit stuns, hit recovery times, and block speeds, were removed as well, making packs of enemies less threatening and encouraging a much more aggressive playstyle. Fast forward to Diablo 4, where the tension of the gameplay introduced in Diablo 1, due to resource management, its narrative delivery structure, and player vulnerability, is all but gone. Now, even a magic wielder can jump headfirst into a pack of enemies with little concern for consequences, and then mow them down with ease in a game that seems designed to require minimal cognitive load to play and to be accessible to a diverse audience of gamers. And making a game accessible is not inherently a bad thing, and it can have great financial outcomes. But in attempting to appeal to the broadest player base possible, I feel as though Diablo 4 lost what initially made the series interesting: its wonderful realization of tension in an ARPG package. Now that we've discussed the player experience from the series' foundation and touched on its progression through the years, let's start digging into Diablo 4, its campaign experience, and if it hasn't become abundantly clear already, why I didn't love it. At a foundational level, Diablo 4's core gameplay loop utterly failed to hook me in because of how these features were implemented. Scaling of loot and creatures, loot rarity and frequency, narrative delivery, world design and traversal, and combat. So yeah, pretty much the most important features of the game. Let's start off by looking at Diablo 4's scaling of creatures and loot, which is, in my opinion, the game's most glaring and ubiquitous flaw. In Diablo 4, creatures and quests are scaled to your level. So when you're level 38, creatures and quests are scaled to level 38. When you're level 42, they're level 42. There is some nuance here, as there is a minimum creature level for certain areas, and some content is scaled to be above your level for added challenge. Occasionally, I would find the game scaling creatures to my level or below, or one level above me, but I can't find any information on when or where that's a gameplay rule, and it didn't make much of a functional difference in the gameplay challenge anyways. In addition to creatures and quests, gear is also scaled to your level, or below, so that all drops, assuming they're for your class, are immediately equipable. And generally, the higher your level, the higher the item score of your drops. While there are clear reasons for their use of scaling enemies and items, like player choice and exploration, and multiplayer functionality, I found the scaling to have a significant negative impact on gameplay. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. In my opinion, Having clear player progression relative to enemies, and often enemy progression relative to you, is a foundational RPG feature, and something that D4 is sorely missing. What happens in a lot of action RPGs, for example, is that as the player progresses through the game, they get more powerful as they level up, gain new skills, and get better gear. And while that's happening, they're also progressing through the levels of the game, which makes the creatures more and more powerful. Importantly, the creatures' levels are predetermined based on their position in the game and not based on the player's level. We can see this general design in games like Diablo I, Diablo II, most successful MMOs, turn-based RPGs like Pokemon, just lots of games that feature any sort of player leveling systems. It's everywhere. Perhaps most importantly, though the player character and creatures get stronger as the player moves through the game, this increase in power for the respective parties is not precisely synchronized. This allows for plenty of instances where the player is stronger than their immediate foes, or where the player finds themselves considerably weaker than their enemies. For example, a player might level up several times before moving on to the next game level. They feel overpowered based on their current foes, only to be humbled by a boss in the next level. Or the player might find a piece of gear which gives them a huge boost in power, making them considerably stronger than the creatures for a number of levels. Or the player might rush past a bunch of enemies to quickly get to the next level, not leveling up or gaining new gear, and then find themselves to be outmatched by the new level's creatures. Sometimes your power will be well matched with the enemies, and that's great too. Another thing that unscaled systems do is they allow the player to determine the game's level of challenge outside of difficulty settings. If the player wants, they can challenge enemies which are high above their level, but bridge that power gap with player skill. Or they can choose to gather power before they advance to make fights easier. Awesome, player choice. All of these misalignments in power between the player and their enemies, it's a good thing. It's a good, important thing that's vital to a lot of game experiences. When you don't do what Diablo IV did, and you don't scale creatures to the player's level, you are much more likely to get these misalignments in power. And it's these misalignments that are vital for making the player feel like they're progressing in the game. Sometimes enemies get stronger and you stay the same, making them feel more powerful, imposing, and increasing in relative difficulty, so the player feels like they need to power up before advancing, like when you level up before coming back to fight the Butcher or the Tree Sentinel. And sometimes you get stronger due to leveling up a few times, getting meaningful loot, or unlocking a new tier of spells, and the enemy's power lags behind for a while, making you feel like you're actually progressing your character's power level. It's a constant, asynchronous dance of power-up and catch-up between the player and the enemies. It's beautiful, it's simple, it's nearly ubiquitous, and I believe it's one of the biggest misses of Diablo IV's design. Just to wrap that discussion up, for new players, you don't want the game to feature constant and massive imbalances in challenge, which favor either the player or the creatures. That's just bad balancing. But you want to give the player an opportunity to experience imbalances as a way to motivate them to either increase their skill or their power, or to reward them once they have increased their power or their skill. Alright, let's move on. Another knock-on effect of this level scaling is that you never feel like you're getting significantly more powerful or having a lasting effect on the world, because everything you fight, even stuff from the start of the game, just scales up to meet you. It doesn't matter if it's a rickety skeleton at the literal place you started the game, or one of Lilith's servants in hell. They're the same challenge. In theory, this keeps more content accessible and meaningful to you for longer, but it also continues that flat curve and compromises feelings of power growth. That criticism could be given to fighting the same creatures on multiple difficulties multiple times in Diablo 1 or 2, and it is a little bit weird to be an ultra-powerful character who just killed Baal, and then you get your ass kicked by a Quill Beast, but because they're on explicitly ascending difficulty settings, it feels a little bit less bothersome to me. Okay, last gripe about level scaling, I promise. If your goal in Diablo 4 is to just beat the campaign, once you've reached the minimum recommended levels for the zones or missions, you truly have no incentive to fight the creatures. If you level up, they will too. If you get a new piece of gear, you'll probably just replace it shortly after. It's way more time efficient to just run past everything. And obviously, that's not a great way to encourage players to engage with your game content. Now, let's talk about loot. Let's chat about how a game's loot drop rates and how frequently the player upgrades their gear affects gameplay and how exciting it is to get new loot. Let's just get this out of the way at the start of this section. I think that Diablo 4's loot during the campaign experience is extremely uninteresting and unrewarding. The game gives you an overwhelming number of upgrades that have a minute impact on gameplay, making each upgrade feel meaningless and loot overall feel just not exciting. Let's unpack that a bit. In Diablo 4, most creatures are scaled to your level, as is the loot that they drop. So each item you pick up will have a minimum level that is below your character's level. Gear doesn't have stat requirements, and it's also often tailored to your class. So almost every item drop is immediately equipable and has a high chance of being an upgrade. This creates an extremely high frequency of gear replacement as you're moving through the campaign. I have some numbers to back this up. We'll look at that in a few minutes. This results in the player constantly swapping in new pieces of gear that provide a marginal, often unnoticeable effect on gameplay. So how is this different from Diablo 1 and 2's drop and replacement rate, which I quite liked? In Diablo 1 and 2, loot type and item level is determined by the level of the creature, not the player, meaning you won't get higher level loot until you advance through the game levels. All gear has stat and level requirements, so you often have to build your character up to use them, and loot is not tuned to your character, so any item can drop for any class. All these factors contribute to making a much slower rate of gear replacement than Diablo 4. Big deal, right? Well, the rate of gear replacement may appear inconsequential to the player's experience, but I think that well-paced gear replacement is vital to creating meaningful loot. And in the Diablo franchise, I found that a slower rate of replacement made gear more exciting and more meaningful than a rapid rate. To illustrate my point, here's a bit of a stupid sports analogy. I've often felt like getting a new piece of gear in Diablo 1 or 2 is like scoring a goal in soccer or football. It doesn't happen all that often, but that makes it more exciting when it does happen, and gear upgrades are more likely to feel impactful because of their infrequency. Whereas getting a new piece of gear in Diablo 4 felt more like scoring a basket in basketball. It's constantly happening throughout the game, so you don't get those jump out of your seat, take off your shirt moments too often. Stupid analogy aside, I wanted to see how different the gear turnover rate was for each Diablo game. So I performed some pseudoscience by playing through D1, 2, 3, and 4, with the same criteria for how long I would play the game, how I would play the game, when I would replace my gear, and when I would start my gameplay timer. And I'm sure my gear choices aren't perfect, but I think they fairly reflect the decision-making of a player with some experience. So basically, in each game, I spent 2 hours killing creatures, exploring, and following the campaign, and in that time, here's how many upgrades each game gave me. For Diablo 1, I actually did this experiment twice. On my first playthrough, I started my timer when I had this gear, and I found only 5 upgrades. I was a little uncertain if this playthrough was representative of an average gear replacement rate because of these reasons on screen here, so I decided to do another playthrough as a warrior. Here's my start gear, and I ended up getting 10 upgrades on the warrior versus the sorcerer's 5. In Diablo 2, with an assassin, I started my timer with this gear and acquired 15 upgrades over my 2 hours of playtime. In Diablo 3, I played on a monk on normal difficulty with no paragon points assigned. I started my timer with this gear, and I upgraded my gear 27 times over those 2 hours. So our trend of increased gear turnover rate continues. And finally, in Diablo 4, I played on World Tier 2, which was the hardest difficulty available to me. I started my timer with this gear and acquired a lot of gear. A shitload of gear. I upgraded my gear 46 times within my 2-hour time limit. So if you weren't paying attention, that brings our total upgrades to be Diablo 1 with a sorcerer, 5 upgrades, Diablo 1 with a warrior, 10 upgrades, Diablo 2 with an assassin, 15 upgrades, Diablo 3 with a monk, 27 upgrades, and Diablo 4 with a sorcerer, 46 upgrades. Now, there are some huge caveats to these numbers, like the number of kills per minute in each game, how deterministic loot is in each game, choice error on my part, how deep I am into the game, item stats, class-specific drops, And because these are different games, there is an incalculable number of confounding variables between my play sessions. But I think these numbers fairly represent the difference in gameplay. And that difference it's significant. These numbers mean that on average in Diablo 1, I was upgrading a piece of gear every 12 to 24 minutes. And in Diablo 4, I upgraded a piece of gear every 2.6 minutes. That rapid pace of gear replacement has a negative effect on how exciting it is to get upgrades. The more often something happens, the less exciting it is inherently. You know, like scoring in basketball versus scoring in soccer. And I was getting upgrades in D4 all the f***ing time. It felt totally meaningless to equip a new piece of gear. The only loot that felt like it had functional, tangible impact on gameplay were the unique items, because they altered skills in an obvious way. And that's great! But only one of the 46 items I got during the playthrough were unique. The other 45 just helped me maintain some homeostasis of the game's scaling difficulty. I think that Diablo 4's prioritization of loot quantity over quality is a terrible strategy for getting the player excited about loot. More loot is not better. Interesting, well-paced, and impactful loot is better. And for an example of that, just look back at Diablo 1 or Diablo 2. When you turn over gear less often, upgrades don't need to be some crazy build-defining uniques to be impactful or exciting. They can just be a notable increase in damage output or damage negation, and the player will feel the difference. But when gear is constantly turning over, items need to be much more complex and transformative to gameplay, by altering skills for example, for them to feel impactful. For another example of how simple loot can be exciting, just think of the first time you leveled through a good MMO. You're advancing through a zone, the creatures are increasing in level, and your time to kill with each creature is slowly increasing, until you get a new weapon drop and then your time to kill decreases notably. All it is a tangible increase in player damage, but regardless, it feels frickin' good to get that new weapon, and a huge part of that is the infrequency of upgrades. Because if it happened all the time, your jumps in power wouldn't be as dramatic or as noticeable. After this little experiment, I felt justified in my original opinion. I find it more meaningful, more exciting, more interesting, more rewarding, just better to have fewer drops that were more impactful on player power versus way more drops with less impact on player power. And Diablo 4's drop rate, it's too much. Diablo 4 delivers an exhausting number of seemingly meaningless upgrades that have little to no functional impact on gameplay, especially when one considers the scaling of enemy creatures and loot. Next, let's look at the narrative delivery and quest structure of Diablo 4 and compare it to Diablo 1. The delivery of Diablo 4's story, and not necessarily the story itself, was another area of Diablo 4 that I didn't love, especially when you compare it directly to Diablo 1, with both games taking quite a different approach to narrative delivery, how it's integrated into the gameplay, and how that synergy between gameplay and narrative makes the player feel. So how do gameplay and narrative interact differently in these two games? Well, they're very different. Diablo 1's able to communicate a sense of darkness through its gameplay, through its player vulnerability, resource management, that kind of stuff, which the narrative bolsters by largely leaving the core gameplay loop uninterrupted. But there's lots of optional narrative that the player can access in town and in the dungeon, and it will generally reinforce the darkness of the game world established by the gameplay. Conversely, Diablo 4 attempts to tell you how dark the game world is through its narrative by constantly halting gameplay to deliver story beats. The towns and villages also have additional context for quests, but when you combine the constantly halting narrative with low-tension gameplay, due to excessive player power, no resource management, generous checkpointing, etc., the game stifles its ability to create a campaign that feels dark. And making a game that felt darker was an important development goal and marketing tool for Diablo 4. Just look at the marketing videos.
We really wanted to return to our darker roots.
The much darker style is very macabre.
It's not for the faint of heart. It's gory and unnerving. It's creepy.
But does that feeling of darkness actually translate to the player? Not for me, it didn't. As a prime example of the tonal misalignment between the narrative moments and the gameplay, look at the Elias boss fight, or probably any boss fight for that matter. The preceding cutscene is dark, violent, and gory, but once the gameplay starts, all that tension melts away as you once again take the reins of your hyper-powerful character, to which Elias is not really a threat, and you proceed to pummel his pale little cheeks. Playing Diablo IV felt like watching a movie where the protagonists constantly talk about how hopeless everything is and how scared they are, but the audience isn't scared at all. They don't feel any of that tension. And while that's primarily due to the misalignment between the tone of the narrative and how powerful the player is, the way the game delivers its narrative further inhibits its ability to generate tension. Whereas playing Diablo 1 is like watching a movie that focuses less on telling the viewer to be scared and focuses more on actually building that feeling of tension and fear in the viewer. So when we look at Diablo 1 and 4, one makes you feel something through its gameplay, which is bolstered by the narrative, and the other tells you how you should feel through the narrative, but is contradicted by its gameplay. Does that make sense? Whatever, moving on. I felt that Diablo 4's narrative delivery demonstrated how bigger budgets don't always result in better features. Sometimes, depending on the game's genre, a more stripped-down, implicit delivery of story will be better to support the feel and flow of the game. And sometimes more explicit in-your-face story delivery is better too. To illustrate how Diablo 1 may have actually been a better vehicle for delivering narrative for a dark ARPG, I'm going to compare the quest beats of an early quest in Diablo 1, the Butcher quest, versus Diablo 4's The Knight and the Magpie quest chain. Both are essentially the first non-tutorial quests in their respective games, and I think that they're fair representations of each game's narrative delivery structure. Let's have a little peek at how the story of each quest is delivered to the player, and how that delivery either supports or hinders the gameplay loop and the narrative tone of the game. In Diablo 1, almost all of the quest dialogue is optional, I think, so the player could experience the Butcher quest in some different ways. On one hand, the player could complete the quest by just starting the game, busting right through the town, ignoring all the NPCs, ignore this beautiful puddle of soup on the ground, go down, fight the Butcher without any context delivered via the game's characters or interactables. Alternatively, the player can spend time in town talking to each of the townsfolk, familiarizing themselves with the cast they'll be spending their gameplay time with. You can learn if and how the Butcher has personally affected each of these characters, giving greater context to the Butcher character, but also providing important backstory for the townsfolk, like how the Butcher was responsible for snatching Wirt's leg, or how Farnham's substance use stems, at least partially, from his traumatic encounter with the Butcher. Once the player enters the cathedral, with as much or as little context on the Butcher as they'd like, it's now the player's responsibility to find the Butcher. There are no quest markers pointing the player to the Butcher's precise location. There's no loading screens or boss arenas separating him from the surrounding environments. And no characters to hype the Butcher up and tell you who you're about to fight. You truly discover the Butcher for yourself. You know that the Butcher is somewhere, but you don't know that he's behind this particular set of doors, despite its bloody contents. And once you open the door, he says his now infamous line, "Fresh meat," and immediately pounces on you. It all plays out pretty organically. You're exploring, you open a door, he attacks you. Once you're able to fry his sweet little tushy, which might take a few tries, you're gifted with some deterministic loot, the powerful yet fragile Butcher's Cleaver, and then you can return back to delve deeper into the dungeon. This all adds up to a quest which actively contributes to the game's tension, lore, and rewards through a simple, compelling, and optional narrative arc. No one forces exposition on you. No one stops you to tell you who you're about to fight and why you should care. You discover the boss, with as much or as little context as you want. Even the boss itself is optional. The Butcher is just part of the cathedral. He's not waiting at the physical end of the level for you. He's just there, waiting for you to fight him or not, which lends even more suspense and reward to ultimately finding him and defeating him. It's beautiful but imperfect, but most importantly, it serves the gameplay well. Let's compare that Butcher quest from Diablo 1 with Diablo 4's The Knight and the Magpie quest chain, which I'm showing here. While I'm talking about this quest chain, I'm going to keep a tally of the number of times the mission requires you to stop for the game to deliver narrative. Remember, the Butcher never forces you to stop for narrative. This is the first crit path quest you get once you've completed the introductory area. Because it's a continuous chain, it's kind of difficult to determine where the quest chain starts. So I'm just going to start it at the first conversation you have after you've entered the open world, in all likelihood for the first time in the game. Like most of the crit path missions in Diablo IV, it starts off with a conversation leading to a multi-destination quest, which is punctuated by various conversations and cutscenes, which are pretty well executed, with voice acting, animations, and some dynamic camera work. But unlike the Butcher quest in Diablo I, the player's engagement with the narrative is not optional. The quest requires you to wait for animations and to initialize conversations and cutscenes. And this quest requires a lot of narrative interaction, including the introductory conversations. From the start of the quest to killing the boss at the end, the game requires you to stop for a cinematic, conversation, or animation 21 times. Compare that to the Butcher's 0. Just let that sink in for a second. The game stopped me at least 21 times in a quest that took me less than 20 minutes to get from the initializing conversation to the final boss. And boy oh boy, does that constant stopping and starting compromise the game's ability to produce any gameplay tension, especially when you consider how easy the game is and how inconsequential deaths are. Overall, this narrative delivery structure constructs a dramatically different flow of gameplay than Diablo I. And sure, Diablo IV tries to tell a more complex, explicit story than D1, but does that make for a better ARPG experience? More specifically, does that make for a better Diablo experience? I don't think so. But who am I to say what the gameplay identity of Diablo should be? To help illustrate how narrative delivery can compromise game flow, let's apply D4's narrative delivery to a different franchise. From Software games have a similar narrative delivery structure to the original Diablo, with narrative hubs, relatively uninterrupted exploratory gameplay, lots of optional lore that helps build context. But could you imagine playing through Elden Ring 4? Where you have an NPC follower who, while in the crit path areas, stops you every minute for an obligatory conversation before you're able to continue exploring? It wouldn't really feel like it was in the same franchise as the original Elden Ring, would it? It's such a grossly different style of gameplay. And that's how I feel about D4 versus D1. And yes, Diablo IV is following a logical progression of narrative delivery that was established in Diablo III, but that doesn't make it any more fun to play. Speaking of Diablo III, many of D3 and D4's quest bosses follow a similar structure, with the bosses generally at or near the termination point of the dungeon. They're introduced with a cutscene and are physically isolated from the rest of the space to ensure that their animations, behaviors, and balance are all consistent, which, unfortunately, gives quests a predictable structure. You kinda know what's gonna happen before it happens. An exception to this was D4's use of the Butcher, which has a similar jump scare effect as D1's use of the Butcher. I thought it was great. It was one of the few unexpected moments of gameplay I had in D4, which was legitimately challenging to survive, which was awesome. I liked it, and it showed potential for what D4 could have been with more challenging balance and a less halting narrative. But that's not the reality of the game. D4's tendency to frequently halt the player to deliver story is not isolated to a single quest. It happens throughout pretty much all of the campaign missions. This game requires you to stop and wait a lot. Now, I respect when series try to increase their narrative depth with each new title, but unfortunately, I found Diablo IV was at its absolute worst when attempting to do more narratively driven missions. Demonstrated quite specifically by the Secrets of Zakarum quest chain, or whatever it's called, I don't know, which is just minutes of watching an NPC do narratively important actions, punctuated by uninteresting exploration and the occasional clicking of objects in a room. There are actually 2 points in this mission where people just tell you to click on stuff while they do the narratively important things. Very riveting. There is a reason why games employ a dynamic camera during conversations, because if the story isn't interesting and the player has no input in it, it can be excruciatingly boring to watch a scene play out in an isometric view. Now, I don't generally talk to myself when playing games, but this mission elicited a very audible and sincere, "Holy shit, this is boring," after arriving at my 5th location where I just had to stand and wait while characters talked at me for minutes. This questline was a potent reinforcement for how entertaining it can be to simply venture deeper into a dungeon, trying to find the next level, with your only goal being to kill the big bad boss at the end. Point of clarification for skipping narrative: the player can skip conversations and cutscenes where they lose control of their character, although I still feel that this is a significant distraction from the flow of gameplay, and conversations and animations that occur while you still have control of your character are not skippable, which can be pretty painful to sit through. Wrapping up our discussion of narrative, let's touch on how narrative delivery can compromise the player's connection to the game environments, its towns, settlements, whatever. Because Diablo IV's story is largely delivered through a cast of traveling characters, I rarely found myself retreading to the same spaces multiple times to speak to an individual, like you might find yourself doing in Diablo 1 when you talk to Griswold, or Diablo 2 when you talk to Akara. In Diablo 1, the story is carried by the townspeople who you regularly are forced to interact with. These characters are the ones you're buying and selling items from, using for repairs, identifications, and healing. They're vital for both the story and the gameplay. And in a lot of ways, the story of Diablo 1 is much more intimate because it is their town being affected. In Diablo 4, the main delivery mechanisms for the story, being Dawnin, Lorath, and Nyrel, are mobile. They'll just meet you at your quest's starting location if they have something to do with it. This ended up limiting the amount of time I spent in each town, ultimately making them feel like tools to support my gameplay needs, versus a village with inhabitants that I cared at least a little bit about. And this compromised my feeling of connection to any of the game's towns or townsfolk. And the game has a bit of a theming issue. Considering the world is filled with so many horrors, there sure are a lot of totally functional outposts scattered throughout the landscape. For the purposes of being more thematically consistent, and to help the players build deeper relationships with settlements and their inhabitants, I think the game would have been better served by having fewer inhabited settlements, with waypoints just out in unoccupied space. This would make the world feel more dangerous, and might help the player feel more strongly connected to the settlements that are occupied, the people in them, and their stories of survival and hardship. So, a little bit closer to something like Diablo II. Okay, that's it for part 2. Come back for the final part where we explore Diablo 4's difficulty, combat, creatures, world design, and traversal, and compare these designs to those from earlier in the series. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.